Okay, good. All right, guys, welcome to the next installment of the Introductory Meet series. And I'm just going to put up my screen. And here we go. So, as a lot of the folks had mentioned, they were interested in doing some conversation and exploration around track work and wiring track. And I looked at a lot of videos and I realized that, man, there's some fantastic videos. So we're not going to get into any real in-depth conversations around the wiring, but we will discuss that. And I have some slides at least to give you an idea of where to go to look for some of what I consider experts. I saw a couple of great videos, but with that, as always, this is just really informal. Interrupt. Let's let the conversations go where they go and see what happens. So when DC and I were talking about this and you're talking about track, I mean, the thing that when I look at my own experience is really get an idea of what I want to accomplish with building a railroad. So all these things came into consideration. And the one outstanding lesson I learned was being careful to not overly do the prototypical elements, which I did in Atlanta, because I would do that very different had I thought about this a little bit more. But anyway, those are just rhetorical questions for you. And then we looked at, wow, if you're going to have a backdrop, that could influence how or what you do with your track and when you choose to put that up so it doesn't inadvertently become an impediment to doing the track work. We'll take a look at, some period photos and other things to consider. The codes, which I think you're all probably very familiar with, so I'm not going to take too deep a dive in that. And then, are you hand laying? Are you doing commercial? And so those are some of the companies that I personally have used. I don't know of any others, or if I haven't used others, like Charlie has used Fast Tracks. Couple of tips around laying them. And then when I looked at wiring, holy smokes, there's just so many elements to wiring. And those were just some of the ones that I discovered. And then, of course, there's always the turnouts, are you doing points or stubs? And then when I looked at this whole list on this slide, you got about at least 6, 8 clinics right in here that we could take a dive into, that if is of interest, we can do that. So when we were looking at backdrops, you might want to consider what's the height, and is it going to be coved, or can you live with corners? And then there's all these different materials. So I use primarily masonite. There's some folks that have worked right off their walls, and then if people are interested in aluminum, I think some of you were on the call when we talked about layout updates. Phil was talking about how he used aluminum, and of course there's styrene and a linoleum. Those two I have no idea as to what you do to attach those.
I would be careful with styrene, because you're likely to get a lot of sag there over time.
Yeah. So these are just some shots that give you an idea. So I did 3-foot backdrops on my peninsula because I really wanted to separate crews from one side or the other. 2 reasons. One, I wanted people to have an experience of just being in a different section of the railroad. And 2, I want to minimize the bleed or the noise of conversations from one side to the other, so guys would have a minimal distraction. This is Rhett Tyler's layout. You can see all he did was put up, I think, a piece of masonite in his old layout, and he might have used a commercial backdrop. This is Charlie's, where I think the mural is about 6 feet. And if you have a nephew that's talented, or you can somehow negotiate with Brian Kammer, or maybe even a local artist, somebody that's affiliated with one of your universities or what have you. And This is LeBron's, and he used a commercial paper backdrop, but given his artistic expertise, he actually painted the clouds. He painted in a church and some other buildings and some fields. So the commercial backdrops are great. And this is an example of a 1 foot or less height backdrop, which I had in Atlanta because I needed to have access. This is where the prototypical thing went off the rails. It's 3 feet across. And in order for me to access, what I did is I made these removable. So I just put in a piece of angle rail, whatever this thing is called, so I can lift them out. So just to give you an idea of what some options for backdrops to be thinking about that. And then, of course, the prototypical images. So let me see, period images rather. So one of the first things I looked at was, need to move this out of the way. There we go. Why are you not moving? Move, Mama-san. Okay, we have there we go. So one is the roadbed. You know, I know there's a lot of conversations about this. And for the most part, I think everybody knows that track was primarily just laid right on the ground as that shot in City Point. But then you have some images, and I'm sure there's plenty that you've seen already, where it might have been a fill, or maybe there's some areas where they did roadbeds, like in the picture on the lower right, where it talks tie shapes there. You can see there is a bit of a roadbed. But the thing that I really was attracted to, from, as maybe some of you, I know some of you are, is how prototypical you want it. And you can see how ties were either, like the one looks like it was milled, almost square, and then you have the others that are all chipped off or hewn. And, you know, the sides would have been bark. So something to consider.
And that's actually one of my biggest questions, is when exactly did the manicured ties really come into, you know, common use?
Well, if you look at the one in Atlanta there, all those look like they're fairly milled. So you can get away with either. And this is a guess, and I'm open to others' views here, is that in the major areas, they might have had more of the milled ties. And as they got further out into the rural areas, you might have seen more like the ones that are hewn on that lower right shot. So,
well, what I was just saying is on those milled or unmilled ties, I guess, because I was entertaining the idea there's no tie plates or anything, and so I was going to take like barbecue skewers, paint the outside, put them in a vise, and get a belt sander and flatten them so that the outside was painted, the inside was the raw color, and then cut them to length with like an end cutter, because I'll get that chopped look, lay them down, and then once they're laid down in place, and then you can shoot them your weathered look so that you get the bark outside different color than the inside.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say that. We have a slide coming up that DC will speak to that.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's cool.
Okay.
That's great. That's great, man. It kind of reinforces what DC and I tried to put together, that hopefully somebody would have some interest in this. That's great. And then the other is the tie spacing. So you can see over in Atlanta, they look like they're not fairly, but they're very exact in the spacing. But yet you'll find on many photos, there's not only gaps, but sometimes they were a little bit cattywampus, whatever that's called. They're angled. Yeah. And so I love the spacing effect. So with that, let me show you a couple of other shots here of period photos. In Alatoona Pass, you can see it looks like there's a bit of a roadbed there. And at first, like, this is the main line over to the right, and this is the spur, which connects to the wood mill. And I thought that maybe this was actually higher, but I think it's just an illusion, because, you know, the modern railroads had their mains on a roadbed, and the spurs were usually right on the ground. But I think it's just more of an illusion. And then tie lengths. So Jesus, you can even, you know, really have some character versions that give such a texture to your track if you are inclined to alter the lengths. So this is Rhett. He used Flex Track, and for the most part, he just used the ties as the color as they were, right? And he uses, I think, microengineering weathered track. This was Al Mueller's, and Al had spray painted and then weathered his ties. Again, it's all, his might have been Atlas Flex Track. This is Charlie's. Of course, you know that he did fast tracks, and I have a couple of slides of what he did with respect to his ties. And this is LeBron's. LeBron, I consider to be the George Celios of our period. I mean, he loves to weather his stuff, and it always looks really cool. And you can see all the texturing he did with his track.
He's got tons of details.
Oh, I mean, he has the courage to even weather his locomotives, which not too many of us have. Codes, I think you guys all know this. You know, I mean, if you really wanted to do it crazily, you could do code 40, which is the most prototypical. It's 50-pound rail. I went to 83. Knowing what I know today, I probably would have done 70 at the very least. The Atlas, for those of you that don't know, Atlas is the most flexible, but it doesn't hold its shape. At microengineering, it's more difficult to shape, and there's a couple of videos where they show you ways to get it to be in the curvature that you want. But although it's a little bit more difficult to shape, it will hold it once you have it positioned. So, yeah.
Yeah, the microengineering too for us in modular, we found it to be very weak, that it would destruct itself quite heavily, or so that's one of the things I like microengineering. It's very nice looking, but it's not quality, or well, it's not real strong to be able to be moved or used in anything like a modular layout where they're moving it all the time.
Right.
The track breaks real fast.
Right.
It pops out of the ties.
Pardon?
The rail pops out of the ties.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you, Tom.
Oh,
One of the questions I had,
stuff
and
too.
you kind of hit on it, but most flex tracks and like Atlas track, it's all perfectly aligned, just like to put all the ties in and stuff like that. I would think that time, like even the South, probably heavily put in by slaves, and I don't think it would have been real accurate as far as lining up all the ties and stuff like that. It'll be close, but not perfect.
Are you saying that they wouldn't have been that consistent with the spacing, Tom?
Well, not just the spacing, but right and left, the ends aren't going to be perfectly in line.
Right.
Like modern day tracks, they're perfect.
Manicured. They're not as manicured.
Right.
And that's one reason I kind of like.
Tom, you're breaking up. We're losing you.
Pardon?
We lost you for a second there. Your audio wasn't coming through.
Oh, I said I like Pico track because it's real strong. We found that for the modular groups. Ties are not perfectly aligned. Sometimes they might even be just instead of straight, they might be off a little bit or something like that, or in this way.
So you said Depot Track is the manufacturer?
Pico, P-E-C-O.
Pico. Oh yeah, Pico. Yes. Great. That's a good. Yep. That's great. Thank you for that.
Okay.
So what I did in order to make it more prototypical, I would take every third or fourth tie out of the rail, just clip it out, and then shift the ties along the rails for some more spacing. And then, to George's point about, altering them, you can shave the top off, cut the sides off, and give them more of that rough hewn look. And this goes to the point that George was talking about skewers. So DC, you want to speak on that for a second?
Okay. Well, actually, the track you see is on a module or diorama I built, on which I could, the area behind the rail, I could put buildings and structures and create scenes, photograph them, then take them down. So it's a straight track. It's only about 4 foot long. What I did was I made a jig to keep the two rails, so I have the proper spacing between the rails. And then they were inverted, so on the side that was facing up, which is the bottom of the rail, I glued the top bamboo skewers I made. I use super glue. Okay, again, I'm not doing curves here. I just use super glue. And I've had this thing since, I think, 2006. And I've never had any problems with it. Now, to do the ties, I took and I cut them to length. And like you saw with Tom, how he used the nipper. Well, I use the nipper to do that with. And then I stained them. Okay. Actually, I sanded them off like you said and stained them. And I found that once I actually got them in here, I needed to sand them a little bit and stain them a little bit more. If I had to do it again, has anybody here laid standard standard rail using the standard techniques?
I'm not sure we know what you mean.
Okay. You can make jigs that will keep your spacing approximately even. Okay. And you lay your tie. Tom, can you take this away a minute?
Oh yeah.
So I kind of want to be able to show on the screen.
Yep.
Using my hands. Okay. You take, I just see you. Okay.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah. Can anybody else see me, or is it just Tom?
I can see everybody.
Okay.
You probably have your view on speaker or something.
Okay. Anyways, if I had to do it again, I'd stain my bamboo skewers and cut them to length. And then you make a jig in which there's on a piece of board, you space pieces of styrene or plastic or wood, whatever, and you lay your cut to length pieces of bamboo in there, right?
Yep.
Then you take a piece of tape and you run it across the top, okay? So when you lift the tape out, all those pieces of bamboo come out. On your road bed, then you'd put something like PL 300 or whatever adhesive you're using, and you can actually put your ties into that, give them a minute, take a straight edge and hold it down and peel off the tape,
Right.
and your ties are embedded. Then I would sand the tops of the ties even. At that point, once everything's dry,
Right.
would sand the tops of the ties even. That way you'll have the bark look on the side of the ties. The ends will look like cut wood because you cut them after the bamboo skewer was
Stained.
And that should match whatever the surfaces that you sanded down. So you have a level surface on which to lay your track.
Right.
Now, if you're using bamboo skewers, if you're planning on using track nails, you're going to find you need to pre-drill your holes because bamboo skewers are a lot harder than basswood. And
Actually, I found even when I was hand laying track for the switches, it's best to drill a hole in there because a lot of the time they're going to split.
okay.
Yeah.
But you can vary the lengths and everything with these, you know, and to do curves, you take your tape and you can kind of bend it to the curve.
Yep.
And you get a natural curve and ease whenever you've drawn them on your particle board or plywood or styrofoam or
Whatever the bench is.
whatever the bench is. But I would lay them straight on there.
Okay. Good, good, good.
Did you go back to that picture again, Tom?
Yep.
There. Okay.
Right.
The other thing, you can hardly tell, but this behind the track, anything on the far side of the track, is just slightly level with the track, but on the near side, that actually slopes down.
Right.
Almost like you had done a fill. And now, of course, fills were done with soil, whatever they took from the cuts.
Right.
And so I did that so that when I'm photographing, I can get a lower camera angle without running into the fascia of the diorama.
Right. Good.
Somebody had a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, did you lay that directly? What's the sub road bed made out of? Did you use homosat?
That was just styrofoam.
Was it just styrofoam? Okay.
Yeah, I laid it on styrofoam, and yeah, it's held down. You'll notice that you don't see any nails here on any of it. So none of it's, well, actually down.
You have spikes every so often in there. You have a couple. There's one spike there and there's one spike there.
Okay, yeah, there might have been a couple.
It's about every 6 ties.
Right. Yep.
Also,
Good.
if like DC was saying about the making a jig, if you're lazy or don't want to reinvent the wheel, Fast Tracks does have a jig ready that for laying ties and stuff.
Got it.
Tom, if you don't mind, the could there be a basic rule of thumb that kind of says that track laid at stations should be more or less applied directly to the ground, and tracks across country need some sort of a road bed or something?
Not
Yes or no, or
no,
good
no,
question.
I would say there is no standard. Because the whole idea was they wanted to minimize how much digging and what have you they would have to do. So they would try to lay it as flat as could be. I mean, there's some shots. There's one of Atlanta of the mill where they did a fill. And there's some cross country shots where it's all flat. The one thing that I did read about, and in some photos it's evident, is they would try to leave a trench between tracks as like a gutter to minimize any kind of flooding. But I didn't pay much attention to that as I built my as I laid my track.
Now keep in mind, like at City Point, a lot of the track work you see in the photos of City Point, they actually laid that track on trestle work. And then
Right.
you'll see one shot of heading off towards the turntable. There are a couple flat cars filled with earth. So basically they used trestle work to get it up quickly. And then as they were doing cuts and stuff, they would load that dirt on flat cars and they brought it in and they actually filled it in around a lot of that trestle work, as you'll see as the photos progress at City Point. So they tried, and the other thing is that during this period, they tried to keep grades as low as possible.
Right.
And so you'll see right-of-ways were a lot windier than they would be today. And then once the track was laid and they had some revenue coming in from that line, then they might go back and straighten out some of those curves.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
To DC's point about using, some adhesive, some kind of caulk, the other thing that I learned is you want a very thin layer between the ties and whatever your bench is, so it doesn't get pinched up through the ties. It took me a few times to learn that one. And then the other thing was, which would be standard, would be to rust out the web of your rails. Of course, it's only on the aisle side where people can see it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Is that still steel rail at the time, or was there
Iron.
Okay.
Yep. All iron.
And were they using 34-foot sections at that point in life, or?
Oh,
Because
man.
obviously they're not using welded rail like we use today.
No.
I think the sections were shorter, didn't we? Figure
Yeah.
that out at one time.
I think on the average, they were like 20 feet.
Right.
Okay. And what type of you may be about to cover this, so I apologize for jumping ahead, but what
No.
type of a rail joiner was it? Was it similar to what we see now, or?
They actually
Wow.
used wood blocks on the outside.
I'm sorry?
You actually, I don't know, did you find an image to show that, Tom?
I did. You know what? I forgot to put that one up. Yeah, go ahead,
Okay.
DC.
Okay, they would put wood blocks, like you'd have the joiners now with the two holes on either side. Well, those
Mhm.
initially started as just blocks of wood
Huh.
that were bolted into, the rail was bolted in them wherever there was two rails met. You can do that either by using styrene or something like basswood, or there's actually, nowadays you can buy
Laser cut.
laser cut stuff and 3D printed stuff. There are different types of joiners you could get today if you wanted to.
Yeah, I bought a package of laser cut joiners. They're very tiny. I guess scale wise, they might be under 2 feet. And yeah, they look great. But there was something else I was going to say, which I forgot.
I think there were iron joiners as well during this time period.
Yep.
But for cost effectiveness, the wood was probably, from what I've seen, is more predominant.
DC, were they called chairs?
No,
I hear that
No,
reference
the
in
chairs-
Dave Bright's book.
The chairs are something different. Chairs
Okay.
are actually for different type, because early on, like with the B&O Railroad and the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad, they actually had stone embedded in the ground, and they had chairs in which the rail actually set.
Okay,
Okay.
got it.
So let's see, current slide. Come on in here. So this was one of Charlie's ideas around staining. Charlie, you want to speak to these?
All right. Let me say something about spacing. I was reading, I found an annual report for the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. And in it, there's a contract where they're letting for ties, and the M&C spells out ties on 30-inch centers. And that's the first time I've ever
Wow.
found something like that in print. So and actually some of those pictures Tom you showed would be about right. So 30-inch center. And the other thing I found on researching the M&C and the NNC, is a peculiar reference where they spelled out the thickness of bridge ties, you know, and there's 3 inches. They're 3 inches thick. So, and
I'm
realize
sorry, did you say bridge or ridge?
a bridge,
Okay.
and those 3-inch thick ties, you know, were laid on stringers. And so basically the ties were only there to maintain the gauge.
Yep.
Okay. Well, yeah, this is my most recent formula for doing ties. And unfortunately, I did a fair amount of my railroad staining the wood and using different colors and whatnot. And I wish I hadn't, but I'm not going to tear it out. But kind of what I've gravitated to, and walnut is the prettiest. I just get some scrap walnut and resaw it on the bandsaw. Sometimes a table saw if it needs a real smooth finish, you know, for making the bridges. And so this is, some of y'all have been to my house, and this is just out there underneath the basketball goal. And so I'll cut ties, and remember you need some long ties for the turnouts and crossovers, and some of those things get pretty long. So I'll have some long pieces that I can cut later for whatever. So I have all my turnout ties and rail ties, and I use cedar and cypress and walnut. Walnut really looks the prettiest. Okay, all right. And I'll leave them out there, and I'll water them every couple of days. When they dry out, I water them. So, and I'll flip them over, you know, so different areas can get direct sun. All right, Tom, go to that next. Well, and this is, and as far as ballasting, you know, there are plenty of photos especially in Chattanooga, that shows that they use rock ballast. But what I like the look of, it's kind of just a light ballasting on the edge, and it's almost dirt in the middle. I got some seed sifting grates, or this set of seed sifters, and I think it goes like 1 through 8, and so you can get a shovel full of gravel, and you can sift these into the finer grades. And really, for like ground cover, you're almost just looking at the silt. You know, it's just almost like dust. And then you can sift out the sizes you like. And we can that'd probably be another little topic I can do some slides on. But so this is my favorite formula. Almost dirt in the middle, a little bit of rock on the edge.
Yeah.
And Tom, you got another slide
Of yours?
Yeah.
Well, actually, if real quick, I love the way that looks, because a lot of these pictures we've been seeing, it almost looks like the center of their roadbed or sub roadbed, whatever, is raised and kind of goes down. And so that picture actually, because that picture right there, up there in Altoona, you can see how that's raised right there in the middle. And the way you got it, Charlie, looks great.
Yeah, and I will. So I'll put the edge ballast in first, and then I put the fine ballast in the middle, and actually take a paintbrush and tamp it down to try to get that high ridge in the middle.
Okay.
I sent some other stuff to Tom, but obviously it's on the editing floor. But
yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I'm sorry, buddy. But you're right, George. That was one of the things that I realized too, is that when you look on a lot of those images, the dirt actually covered the center of the ties, and they were almost completely exposed in a lot of areas on the ends. So it's another element for that prototypical look. Charlie, what's the slide you thought I had?
I sent 14 of them. But,
14 of them?
14. No, there's one near the bridge. It shows you a different perspective of that.
Hey, Charlie?
Yeah.
Where did you get your seeds, your
seed sifters.
Yeah.
I'll tell you,
That'll be on his, when he does his clinic.
No,
Okay.
I'll post it, but it's a wooden frame and there's a wire mesh in the bottom of each. And I tell you, I got a friend who has a cabin on Greer's Ferry Lake in Arkansas. And it's so the best stuff, it's the best stuff in the world. It's got a lot of iron in it. And so it's not gravel. It's where the lake has begun to wash, into the mountain ridges and whatnot.
Okay.
And so you don't have any shells. You don't have the selenerates in the gravel. It's just this wonderful kind of iron rich, which is perfect for East Tennessee, Georgia, whatnot. And so I got buckets in the garage. If y'all come back, I'll give you a bag of the good stuff.
Kind of like a convention gift instead of mugs
Yeah,
or something.
yeah.
We'll get a bag. I love it, Charlie.
If you Google seed sifters, which I just did,
Okay.
they range anywhere from like $10 for half a dozen to $155 for steel screens. But yeah, they're all various grades of. So there is actually a concept, seed sifters. It's online. If you
Okay.
And the great thing, you can look up like aggregate, why do you call something gravel? Why do you call something whatever? And so these particular sizes have a specific name. And, the railroads need different sizes for different things, but it's fun to kind of apply some science to the sizes. And I got little kind of seasoning shakers of all the sizes up there. And depending on what I'm doing, I'll use a different size. And sometimes you mix it, and put it down with that scenic cement. That's what takes a long time. After you've put all your ballast around the ties, then I take a syringe, and that works the best. And I go between every tie, trying, staying off the rail. The biggest problem is every now and then you'll get a clot in that scenic cement, and you got to kind of loosen it up so it'll go through a syringe. But once you get the hang of it, it only takes you a few months.
I'm gonna have to go back to my diorama and put more soil in now.
So that's called number 8. That's that goes through the 8 seed sifter. Okay, or it's actually called, I call it Super 8. But oh, there you go. There's more. All right, have you got the photo, the actual the real photo from Chattanooga?
Where it shows the fort in the back?
Yes.
Yes. Speak to that and I'll get that other one up in a second.
Well, this that's showing right now, that's the Texas in the train shed. And this is my earliest stuff. And I don't like it. I don't like the ties. And I think the ballast is a little bit large inside. But it doesn't look too bad.
Uh-oh, who's calling? All right, I almost have that up. Let's see, save as.
And that's a Schneider locomotive right there.
Yeah, I was drooling.
Man, it's just.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share for a second and then pull that back up.
I love the colors of the Texas tender.
Yeah, I think Dave is going to do a presentation for us. Oh, here it is. pull that down here. Dude, yeah, Charlie, sorry about that, man. I just saw all those other photos in there, like, whoa.
That's all right. I haven't, I may do another section. I may do Nashville, and I might spike the rails on that, but it would take 15,000 spikes for me to spike my layout. And so
Is this the shot that you wanted?
yeah, and so you can see this is that Kodak spot in Chattanooga. This is that incredible fort. It looks like a Russian log church.
Yeah.
And it's just gorgeous. I always think of that as, the Yankees saying that not only do we hold Chattanooga, but we're having eggs and bacon here in the fort. But the flag, the flag that they flew was 40 feet tall, not long, but tall. I mean, it is enormous. And so the engineers and the firemen, they put rose bushes on the front of their up there.
On the pilot here?
Yeah, those are rose bushes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, to take the picture. But you can clearly see the rock ballast and the wonderfully misshaped or look at that tile right there. Like
I know.
Yeah. So, so that's what that would be my ideal look right there. Kind of a little bit of ballast, broken stone, gravel on the edge, and kind of more dirt-like in the middle.
Got it. Cool. Well done.
Well, they would tamp up the ties if they needed to, when they were odd shaped like that.
Right. This is just a shot from my layout where this, now, Tom, to your point earlier, this might be Pico track, because when Rail Dreams built my benches, they used a lot of this. And when I first saw it, I said, what happened to the track? He says, that was the period look. I said, really? So see, there was so much I didn't even know when I was doing this. So I love the look, and I mimic that by cutting out the ties as I showed you earlier. So that's not right. It says Atlas, but thanks to Tom, these are Pico flex track sections. Okay, what do we got next? Somebody mentioned Homosote earlier. So when you're hand laying, you guys probably know this, you can't use the insulation foam because it won't hold the ties. So I had to inlay sections of Homosote anywhere I wanted to spike down rails. And this is what I mentioned earlier about the PL30. There's so many different, many of you probably know, in terms of caulk adhesives that you can use.
Can I ask a real quick question here before we get out of here? I have actually a couple of things. Number one, on that construction adhesive, I've used on my current much later era, 100 years later era layout. I used liquid nails and just spread it real down thin and just laid the flex track right on top of it. So I highly recommend that, because it keeps that illusion of those track nails from the middle of the spot of the ties from, kind of ruining the look, so to speak, because you've got this one spike in the middle that kind of actually in some cases can even bend the rail or bend the tie down into the wood, into the sub road bed.
Yeah.
Because if you hammer it down too hard, it'll kind of kink that one piece of tie. But my bigger question was, one of the things I've always noticed over the years was when people do hand laid ties, they usually will actually spike about every 3 to 4 ties. And my question is, I understand part of the reasons behind that, and knowing that especially some of the more modern stuff where you have the tie plates, there's usually 1 to 2 spikes per tie on both sides of the rail and both rails. And so what would the actual spiking look like in that era? Did they put a single spike in every rail, or in every tie, or did they put Like
Yes.
every other, or what?
No, from what and guys, you can challenge me on this, but from what I gather, it was 2 spikes for every rail. So every tie would have had 4 spikes directly driven to hold the web of the rail to the tie.
Okay, so like one on each side of the rail.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay. And now, was it centered or was it off centered, or what, did it vary, or was it just
I think
whatever?
to the best of their ability, they tried to center it.
Well, in all honesty, because the reason I asked that question is because, like, one of the reasons I went from using Atlas Flex Track to using the microengineering was because the Atlas Flex Track had that big, giant, overscaled, quote unquote, spike that was dead center every time. But the microengineering had the tie plate casting, and that you could see that they would have sometimes 2 spikes, sometimes 1 spike off centered, and so forth. Like, 1 spike fell out, and that was what I really loved about that track. And so this was kind of, along those lines. If I do, if and when I do a layout diorama, whatever, I want to make sure it's as close as accurate as possible.
But they did not use tie plates back then.
Correct.
Yeah. And I would think that the spikes would be slightly staggered. I mean, just because it would tend to split the rail. I mean, if you had them on, dead center on either side of the rail.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I was wondering, Charlie. Yeah, because I don't think they pre-drilled those, right? Although you see that no, they wouldn't have done that.
No. Yeah.
I can tell you from one summer spent on the Chicago Northwestern in the track gang, even when they had tie plates, there was no guarantee that those tie plates would be centered on the rail.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
So, again, George, you really highlight the beauty of our era. I mean, if anybody wants to challenge anything you've done, you just gotta, you have plenty of images and information to say, nah, that's not exactly so.
Fair enough.
Right. All right. So what do we got? Okay. So wiring, man, this is something that I really didn't, like I said, there's so many cool, really good YouTube videos. But a couple of things I picked up was that I didn't realize is that for HO, if you have a layout main line that's 50 feet or more, the one fellow, this guy, Larry Puckett, called the DCC guy, said 12
I know
gauge.
Larry.
Oh, you do? Oh,
I know
man,
Larry.
he's brilliant. And then if your main line is less, like between 10 and 50 feet, it's 14 gauge, etc. And then he pulls out this speaker wire. It's the clear sheathing with that copper wire. Yeah. And he said 14 gauge wire would be fine for your bus, although it's stranded. And he did all the testing and blah, blah. And he goes into the conversation about how if the wires are close together, you minimize the noise and the interference so that you have great conductivity, blah, blah. And I was shocked to see speaker wire because I've got a reel of that. But anyway.
The boss man, our chief engineer at Soundtracks, actually recommends twisting the bus wires together.
Right. That's what, Larry Puckett said. Yes, that was new information.
Twisting them together.
What do you mean by that, George? Twisting the wires together?
So you've got your we'll say for argument's sake, you're using your red and your black wire. Here, hold on a minute. So you've got your red and your black wire. And so what you're doing is when you're running your bus under your layout, you actually twist it so that you get that spiral pattern. And so when you need to drop your feeders and tie them in there, either using the suitcase connectors or if you want to do the soldering, you just pull it out of the twist. So instead of being like this now, you'd have that one loop like that, and you can add it. And it has something to do with the way that the RFI counteracts when it's spiraled like that. It minimizes the interference.
I've watched a lot of YouTubes. I'm rewiring my track, and because it's going to be over 100 feet done. And there's primary wire, and then there's THHN wire out there. And no YouTube says whether now primary wire they say is for automobiles, and THHN wire, because I'm in the construction industry, is like what they use in your house, and it has to do with the resistance to heat. Now,
Okay.
THHN wire is twice the cost of prime wire. So I don't know if anybody knows whether you got to use THHN or primary.
I mean, honestly, I've always used primary because when, my prior profession before I worked at Soundtracks was working in the auto parts industry.
Right.
So I had,
Lots of primary.
I had contacts that I could get, 100-foot rolls of wire. And I mean, it's all you really need. I mean, I use on mine is, I think I used either 14 or 16 gauge stranded wire that you just pick up off a reel at the auto parts store. 100-foot roll for, I don't know, 10, 15 bucks, something like that.
Yeah, the primary wire is cheap.
Yeah. Of course, then again, this was before the big copper boost too. So copper's gone up quite a bit in cost now. So.
Can I ask a question, George? You might know this.
Okay.
Or whoever out there. Can you use like the wire? I have a lot of wire left over from when I remodeled a house, a farmhouse in West Virginia. And I've got 12 gauge and 10 gauge wire. And it's, it's already, it's like some of it's 2-strand, some of it's 3-strand,
Three conductor.
Okay, yeah, the hot, cold, and the neutral in the center.
Yeah.
Is there a problem with using that?
I mean, it didn't, not necessarily. I mean, the biggest challenge or the biggest reason you use the bigger gauges is so that you have a lot less signal degradation over distance.
Right.
And so, because I mean, it's repeating the signal, and that's part of the reason we use bus wire instead of the rails to transmit our DCC signal all the way around the layout, is because the nickel silver rails that we tend to use has a higher degradation of the signal through it. So if you go in your layout and you just solder all your joints, I mean, technically then you've got a good enough conductor to get it, but the signal degradation is what the issue is. So in reality, the answer is no, not really. But the hardest challenge that you're going to run into if you do decide to use that is if you're using like suitcase connectors or something like that, they're a lot harder to penetrate the solid wire, and especially those bigger gauges, than using like a stranded wire on a smaller gauge.
Would you use 12 or instead of the 14?
Well, if you use 12 gauge stranded wire, then that's probably just fine. It's like I said, the biggest thing is the bigger diameter wire is just going to reduce the amount of signal degradation over distance.
Okay.
And that's part of the reason why when you start having these larger layouts, you want additional boosters. It's not necessarily because they don't think you have enough power. It's because of the signal degradation. And that way the boosters repeat the signal in those particular sections of the layout. So if you're doing a downstairs, basement masterpiece where you've got, we'll say 1,000 foot of rail, you probably want to divide that up into two, or into 4 blocks, 250 foot each with their own boosters, just to make sure that the signal repeating is good and you get a nice clean signal throughout all of that.
Now there's a lot of YouTube, and I've been really spent a lot of time on this, that says there's the suitcase connectors to the bus. That's the problem with YouTube. You get experts that tell you to do it this way, and then experts that tell you to do it that way.
Yep.
Don't use suitcases for your bus because you don't know if the connection's actually hitting.
There is some validity to that, because the suitcase connector, the technical term is insulation displacement connector. And so what it does is just burns through or buries through the insulation, and then you have it touch the wire inside. So it's not the most reliable connection. I mean, the real honest way, if you want to have bulletproof wiring, solder all your joints.
Right.
But the suitcase connection.
I've recently put in my accessory power. I ran a bus for that, and I used 18 AWG. Just
that should be fine.
Thicker. And some of the suitcases didn't work.
Well, remember they have different size suitcase
No,
connectors too.
I have the small, I have the right size,
Yeah, okay.
but you know, I had one or two of them that, and it's that crimping. You know, look, everything's made in China now. You know, I mean, I guess it depends where you buy the stuff.
Not soundtracks decoders.
No, I know that. I
Sorry,
think
had to
it's
get
just,
that in.
you know, out of 100 suitcase, one or two of them going to fail.
Right.
Right. That's right.
So
Yeah.
the good news is they're easy to replace too.
Yeah, so I plan on soldering to the bus.
Yeah, then I mean that's the best rule of thumb, but most people don't always follow the best. They follow because I mean, let's face it, we want to run our trains, we want to get them running quickly. So suitcase
Right.
connectors make it a little bit faster and a little bit quicker.
Well, I did that once already. I did everything and got it up running fast. I used the 22 AWG for my bus, but I got it running fast.
Yeah.
So
It's slowing down these days.
the 2 questions. So those of you that have done this, have you, your connectors to the track, have you wired those to a rail joint, or have you soldered those to rail joiners, or have you soldered directly to the track?
I've done mine directly to the track, although I saw a couple of YouTube videos where fellas, they solder their leads to the base of the joiner that connects the tracks.
Now, Todd, did you solder your track together?
In some sections, yes. I would actually, of all people, Tony Custer and a couple others said that they don't do that because they want to allow for the expansion thing. But by doing that, I got to tell you, every couple of years, I find these like 1/8-inch gaps in my rails, and they're a little bit too wide to fill in with solder, and it becomes a nightmare because now you have to rip out a section of track and replace it. So I'm going to solder my joints. I'm done with these gaps. George?
My whole layout that I have now is everything soldered. The only exception is where the modules are joined together. Obviously, that needs to be separatable. But Ron, to answer your question, what I've actually done was solder the wire to the underside of the rail. So you have your rail coming in, and if you have your wire kind of bent like this a little bit, and you come to the underside, if you use flux and a really fine point solder, then you can get that flux will draw that solder into the joint.
Right.
And then when you ballast or put the ground cover over it, you'll never see that wire ever. Because I've seen the guys where they'll put the wire coming out on the side like this, and then you have the big gap of the rails or that big wire coming out, and you can see it, but it's not terrible because they usually paint it and cover it up and stuff like that. But if you solder the underside of the rail, you get the exact same condition, but now when you ballast, it's covered, you'll never see it.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because that's what I did. I mean, my track was already laid and I didn't have the option to do underneath. So I just used very thin wire and soldered it to the outside of the web on the rails. And you can mask it pretty good if you use very thin wire. But if I was doing it from the beginning, I would have soldered it underneath the rail joiner.
I use rail joiners that had wires as part of them. I don't know if anybody's ever done that.
If you solder those joints, those joiners into the rails, then your connection's fine.
Okay.
Hey George,
Yes, sir.
are you using Homosode or
I actually used, it's a styrofoam base layout, and then I laid N-scale cork road bed because this wasn't a main line. This was a branch line layout that I had. And I laid N-scale cork on the layout, and then N-scale, and then glued the track down. And that was one of the benefits of microengineering, is because if you look at the underside of that, most of the gaps, I mean, most of the ties are all individually applied. There's only a few of them here and there that have the piece of plastic between the ties. And if so, it's even super thin that it's easy to cut, as opposed to the Atlas, which is the whole thickness of the tie. And so it gives you that little bit extra flexibility to solder to the underside, because even if after the fact, you can get in there with a really fine knife and just cut it off if you need to, or you just move your joint one tie over. But here's a little fun fact for you. When you're running your wires through styrofoam, it's a pain in the ass, because you can't drill styrofoam like you do wood, and you don't get a perfect hole. Right. So what I've been doing is I'll buy these styrene tubes. You can use soda straws too. You
Right.
drill your hole, you slide the soda straw through, you put your wire through, and then you pull the soda straw out the other side. Now your wires run and it doesn't catch on any of that foam on the inside of the hole.
Right. Yeah, that's what
I
I've done.
just was just trying to figure out, because you do it on the cork road bed, but if you tried it on styrofoam, you'd probably melt the styrofoam.
If it's directly on there, maybe. I mean, remember the solder, you don't need to leave it on there for a long time. If you have the right tools and you use the right, flux is the big thing. So you can be in and out of there fairly quickly, and I'll play with that and see how long, or if it does. But even if it does, you just ballast it and you'll never see the indentation in the foam anyway.
You can always cut away some of the styrofoam like you do the cork, just so you have a little bit of a groove in there, and you run your wire up. It won't have, and then you just fill it in with caulk or dirt or something. Yep. Good.
Thanks.
All right, let me go back.
Thomas,
So,
I just sent you something on a message about different wires or wiring.
you did.
But you said, is everybody familiar with this company, McMaster-Carr?
No.
No,
I think they're in Atlanta. I'm not sure, but you literally can buy anything tool wise. But there's a type of wire. It's called machine tool wire. I mean, it's just it's a beautiful wire. I mean, it comes in all different gauges and lengths, but it's gorgeous stuff. It's easy to work with. On my layout, I used 12 gauge, not twisted, for the buses.
Well, you say not twisted, you mean you use solid, not stranded?
No, it's stranded, but like George Great was talking about twisting the bus.
Right.
I just got parallel bus, and some of those runs are 100 feet long. So I hadn't had a problem with radio frequency interference. And then I use 18 gauge for feeders, and then I use 22 gauge for the frogs. And that's usually solid. And I do fast tracks. The nice thing about that is, every sixth tie is a copper clad tie that the rail is soldered to. And so I can solder onto the copper clad tie, and I have all sorts of convenient places to drop feeders.
You actually, that's actually a really good thing. If you have those copper clad, you can actually drill into the hole and then disguise your feeder wire as a spike.
Right.
Wow,
I hadn't gone that far, but that sounds like a good idea.
interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, the other thing too was, which we could talk briefly about, was how often do you drop your feeders? And I've always heard that for every section of track, between joiners, you want to drop your feeds, especially for at least HO, with the challenge of continuity for the locomotive. So you're ensuring that you have juice going in there. And I've heard anything from 3 to 6 feet of minimum track for your leads.
Speaking from a professional standpoint, you cannot have enough feeders to your track.
Right.
So at least one for every piece of track, because then it goes back to signal degradation.
Right.
Because we want to make sure that the decoders that you're using, assuming you're using digital anyway, are able to get that command and be able to receive it. Because, we as model railroaders now, I mean, I see it more and more every day where people are using more things like the current keeper, which is a stay alive module. But one thing people don't realize is when they're living on the stay alive module, they're not getting the DCC signal. So you want to try to minimize those interruptions, because if you're running your train and you have a current keeper on there, your track power runs away. Now your decoder is just going to continue doing what it's doing, even though you're pushing the button or trying to turn the throttle down, but the current keeper is making it alive. So you and I don't see the fact that it's lost track power, but it's not getting the DCC signal anymore.
George, you saying that it for modules, it impedes the keep alive to a degree? that what you
No,
said?
no.
Oh.
What I'm saying is that if your decoder loses, or like say if your model's running and the track power drops off because you didn't put feeders on every piece of rail. Well, if you like, and this is really common, especially in a yard situation where you have a yard ladder where you've got 4 or 5 turnouts lined up back to back to back, and everybody has these insulated frogs.
Right.
Well, what happens is that as your locomotive is slowly moving through those frogs, if it loses track power and you have a current keeper, well, the decoder keeps running. So you and I see it as a continued operating locomotive.
Right.
But what's really happening now is if you try to change your DCC throttle, let's say you get your throttle over here and you're trying to reduce the throttle or push a button to stop it or whatever the case is, then that decoder is not receiving that command because it doesn't have track power. It's living on the battery power of the current keeper. And
Right.
so this is why you want to maintain track power everywhere you possibly can. So even like what Charlie was talking about, where you put your power your frogs, there's enough products out there. Either the Caboose Industries has a power routing ground throw, or there's other things out there like a Tam, I think it's Tam Valley, or a frog juicer.
Right.
And what they do is they automatically make sure that those frogs are powered, but they reverse polarity based on what it is. The Tam Valley one does it automatically, through electronics. But the when you use the Caboose Industries ground throw, it does it based on the mechanics. And then if you're also using like those tortoise motors or the cobalt motors, they have the connections on there. Utilize them and power your frogs, because again, that's going to be one less issue that you run into with a decoder shutting down or losing the DCC signal, so that you always maintain control.
Tam Valley makes the frog juicer, right?
Over my frogs. Remember my
Yeah. So that, but Tam Valley makes the frog juicer.
my grant fails out at the frogs.
Right. But I think, George, did
to
you
kind
say
of
that?
compound this issue a little bit, I mean, even in the case of a big boy where you have 100 wheels on each rail, the thing. So to kind of show you, so when the wheel is there, that one point is touching, but as the wheel turns, that tangent point lifts. And so power has to be reestablished either through the same wheel or due to other properties, it'll move to another wheel. And so when you're looking at your locomotive, you want the most possible paths for track power to get to the decoder. But then on top of it, you want to make sure that your track power has enough paths to be able to deliver it to those wheels. So, with dead frogs, you basically, depending on the angle of your frog, you're creating a dead space right there every time. So if that and especially with these small locomotives that we're using for these 440s and so forth, you have limited wheels that are picking up power. And so you want to make sure to maximize as much power both to the decoder and through the rails as you can.
Did you say Tam Valley makes the frog juicer?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So with your decoders, you include a capacitor.
The TSU 1100 has a separate off-board capacitor. It's a 220 microfarad, 20 volt or 25 volt capacitor. And it's just there to help minimize the interruptions, because as I mentioned, when the wheel's turning, power is constantly being interrupted, jumping from wheel to wheel. And the capacitor is designed to help keep that alive during those millisecond losses of power. Now, on the larger decoders, like the 2200, the O-scalers would be using, that capacitor is actually built on the circuit board already.
So that capacitor is the keep alive, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So I don't need a keep alive if I put those in.
Not necessarily, because that 220 microfarad capacitor is only good for about half a second. A current keeper will give you up to 10 seconds. And so that's where the problem comes into play, because if your model's running for 3 seconds without a track power, there's 1,000 commands that decoder's missing.
Wow. Okay. George, I tell you, so do you have a keep alive in that locomotive you are modifying?
The first one I do have one in here, or in it. The second one I'm doing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an array of 4 smaller capacitors for the 220 microfarads because I'm going to add a wiper on the tender trucks. Because the biggest issue with that Bachmann one is the big rubber traction tire on the driver. And so it basically renders one of those drivers useless for track power. So that gives me basically 3 wheels on each rail, the second driver, and then 2 tender wheels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill through. I saw a video on YouTube and I don't know why I didn't even think of it, but I found it where he drilled a hole through this bolster on his Bachmann 440 and then put a phosphor bronze wire out that wiped the back of the wheel. And then you just run that up and in through the tender floor. So there gives you your extra track pickup. So all of this is going to be documented.
Hey,
Boy,
George,
that's an
are you
Al
aware of Harold? Oh, I'm sorry. Are you,
Right, that's an Al Mueller.
okay. George, are you aware of Harold Menkwitz's article on repowering the Bachmann 440?
I do not believe I am.
Ooh.
Okay. Okay, well,
Yeah.
he's done it where he's got a greatly improved pickup system that he's made.
Okay.
And
What's that again?
his name's Harold Menkwitz, Minkwitz. Now, he has passed away, but as of the last time I looked, his articles were still online.
I will confirm that.
Is that Pacific Coast narrow gauge that you go through now, or?
Not sure.
If you look up his name in Google or Bing or something, you should be able to find it. And I haven't done it yet, but I've got a download of his article.
Yeah, Hal does some great work. And also when you were talking, George, about the wipers, I think Al Mueller was one of the pioneers with rewiring. I mean, he even made harnesses for his tenders where he has wires connected to the bolsters in the trucks that would increase power. He also wired he put metal wheels in his trucks to help increase the amount of connection to the rails as well. His rebuild on the General is definitely something that he talks about the wipers and everything else. So I think what you're going to show us will be new, clearly, for a lot of us, as well as affirming some of the things that we've seen or heard about in the past. So that'll be sometime late April, maybe early May. That'd be great. I think we have one more. What's that?
I was just saying that's what my target is.
Yep, cool. Let's see, wiring tips. Feeders, I think we did that. Oh, I wanted to mention the rail joiners. I'll tell you, these micro engineering rail joiners, if you want a low profile, they are spectacular. They're a little tight. And then I saw this article about how somebody made an expander tool, last bullet. And you just take a piece of, spare rail, maybe 6 inches long, and you just file the edges of the base into a V shape, and you can insert it in the joiner to open it up a little bit to make it an easier application into your rails. Or, of course, you just file down the rail base so that it'll receive the joiner a little bit more cleanly. Another tip. You know how when you're soldering and if you're using commercial rail with plastic ties, this one fella, he does this thing called Off the Rails Model Railroad Video Plus. And he read an old article from the 1950s model railroader where somebody just took a couple of pieces of tissue paper and dampened them. And instead of using like tweezers or whatnot on the ends, they would just put the damp tissue paper on either side of the area that you're going to solder as a way to displace the heat to avoid melting your ties. I thought, wow, there's so many cool articles from the 40s and 50s of all these great tips. Anything else? I think we covered all of that. So this is the last slide. And of course, this will be on the recording. And if you want, I can capture this and just send it out to you all. But the first one there, if you're doing breakers, this guy from Fish Plate Films, he's an Aussie, and he's a funny guy as well. But he did a really thorough job of the various methods you could use to either displace a power surge or to attach the breakers from NCE. Larry Puckett, as we mentioned, he's got some great videos. And then for laying flex track, I found these three would be, if you were going to look at how to do that to save you some time hunting, these would be three of the ones you'd want to check out. And then for wiring, you can see Larry Puckett's up again. And then Tom's trains. So that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Not a question, Tom, but would you mail this slide to me?
I sure will. I sure will.
Yeah, if you could send the PowerPoint, it would be great. This way you just click in.
Yep, I'll do that. I'll send you. So Paul, you want the PowerPoint? Tom, you want the slide?
Well, I missed the beginning too. I mean, I
Yep,
don't want to, I can listen to it, but it'd be good to have this slide.
sure. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank